The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
There are television moments that make you laugh, and then there are television moments that make history flinch. Some scenes are so bold, so unapologetically provocative, that they leave a permanent scar on the cultural landscape, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. Fawlty Towers, the British sitcom that ran for just 12 episodes between 1975 and 1979, was never a show that played it safe. From its very first episode, it dared audiences to laugh at things that made them uncomfortable. It dared them to find humor in rudeness, in failure, in the kind of social embarrassment that makes you want to look away, but somehow you never do. And for most of its short run, it got away with it. Until it didn't. The question that has haunted television historians, comedy writers, and devoted fans for decades is simple but loaded. What exactly happened? What was in that one infamous moment, that one scene, that one episode, that crossed a line so decisively that broadcasters in the 21st century began quietly pulling it from their platforms? What made executives squirm, critics sharpen their pens, and audiences across the world divide so sharply between those who defended it as genius and those who called it something far less flattering? To answer that properly, you cannot just start at the scene itself. You have to start at the beginning, at the strange, chaotic, brilliantly improbable origins of a sitcom that never should have worked and somehow became one of the greatest ever made. The year was 1970. John Cleese, already well on his way to comedy royalty through his work with Monty Python, found himself staying at a hotel in Torquay on the Devon coast of England. He was there with the Python team to film location scenes for their television series. It was meant to be unremarkable, a functional stay in a functional hotel. Instead, what Cleese encountered would plant a seed that took 5 years to bloom into something extraordinary. The hotel was the Gleneagles, and its manager was a man named Donald Sinclair. To describe Sinclair simply as rude would be a dramatic understatement. He was rude in the way that natural disasters are rude, comprehensively, unpredictably, and without any apparent awareness that he was doing anything unusual. He treated his guests not as paying customers deserving of hospitality, but as intrusions into his carefully ordered world, intrusions he resented deeply and made little effort to conceal. The stories that emerged from that stay were almost too absurd to be believed. On one occasion, Eric Idle left his briefcase briefly unattended in the hotel lobby. A reasonable hotel manager might have asked around to find the owner. Sinclair, operating on his own peculiar logic, decided the briefcase was a bomb and hurled it over the garden wall. When Terry Gilliam committed the unforgivable sin of using his cutlery in what Sinclair considered the wrong manner, the manager descended upon him like a hawk, correcting his table manners in front of everyone with the righteous fury of a man enforcing natural law. Most people who encountered Sinclair simply endured him, paid their bill, and left with a story to tell at dinner parties. John Cleese did something different. He watched. He studied. He took mental notes on the rhythms of Sinclair's particular brand of dysfunction. The way the man's hostility was always paired with a frantic desire to project an air of respectability. The way his contempt for the people he was supposed to serve made every interaction a potential disaster. And the way he was utterly, completely, and magnificently unaware of how absurd he appeared. Cleese recognized something universal in Sinclair's specific madness. Here was a man doomed by his own pretensions, perpetually at war with a reality that refused to accommodate his self-image. It was, Cleese understood immediately, the DNA of great comedy. To truly appreciate what Fawlty Towers became, you need to understand something about the man who created it. John Cleese was not simply a comedian who stumbled into television. He was a product of one of the most unlikely trajectories in British entertainment history, a path that wound through a quiet seaside childhood, an elite Cambridge education, and a comedy apprenticeship that transformed British humor itself. Born in Weston-super-Mare in 1939, Cleese grew up as the only child of Reginald and Muriel Cleese. His father, Reginald, had made one of the more pragmatic decisions in family history, changing the family surname from Cheese to Cleese in 1923, reasoning that a man who wanted to be taken seriously in professional life probably shouldn't introduce himself with a name that doubled as a dairy product. It was perhaps the first hint that the Cleese family had a complicated relationship with the absurd. At school, Cleese was conspicuous before he ever opened his mouth. By the age of 13, he was already well over 6 feet tall, his gangly frame making him impossible to overlook in any room he entered. He was academically gifted, excelling in ways that suggested a mind that moved faster than the curriculum around it, but it was his eye for the ridiculous that set him apart. At Clifton College, he once painted footprints leading away from a statue of Field Marshal Haig, as though the venerable military figure had simply wandered off mid-afternoon. It was a small act of creative mischief, but it pointed towards something important. Cleese didn't just find authority figures funny. He found them irresistible as subjects for dissection. His path to Cambridge was slightly delayed. National service requirements meant university places were difficult to secure immediately, and Cleese spent a transitional period teaching Latin, science, English, and history at his old preparatory school. It is one of those biographical details that seems almost designed by a screenwriter. A man who would later write some of the sharpest satirical comedy in television history spent his young adulthood teaching Latin to schoolboys, and those Latin lessons would eventually surface, transformed, in Monty Python's Life of Brian. Nothing in Cleese's life went to waste. When he finally arrived at Downing College, Cambridge, he enrolled to study law. What he found instead was the Cambridge Footlights, the legendary comedy club that has served as a launching pad for an extraordinary proportion of British comedic talent. He also found Graham Chapman, the brilliant and chaotic collaborator who would become one of the founding members of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Through Footlights, through the Edinburgh Fringe, through the BBC radio program I'm Sorry, I'll Read That Again, and eventually through Python itself, Cleese developed a comedic sensibility that was unlike anything British television had produced before, cerebral but physical, satirical but deeply human, and always willing to make the audience profoundly uncomfortable in the service of a larger truth. By the time he encountered Donald Sinclair in that Torquay hotel in 1970, Cleese was already a skilled and experienced comedy craftsman. He had the tools. Sinclair handed him the material. The creation of Fawlty Towers was, in several important senses, a love story. Not just the love of two comedy writers for a shared vision, but the literal love story of John Cleese and Connie Booth, the American actress he had married in 1968 and who would become his co-writer and creative partner on the project that defined both their careers. Booth was, in many ways, Cleese's complement. Where he was tall and explosive, she was measured and precise. Where his instincts ran toward the confrontational, hers ran toward the architectural. She had an exceptional eye for story structure, for the way a plot could be wound tighter and tighter until it had no choice but to explode. Together, they made a writing team of unusual potency. Their working method was famously rigorous. Each episode of Fawlty Towers took weeks to write, drafted and redrafted until every joke, every misunderstanding, every escalating catastrophe was as tight as it could possibly be. The chaos you see on screen was the product of extraordinary discipline off it. The character they created from their experiences, both of Donald Sinclair and of human nature more broadly, was Basil Fawlty, the owner and manager of a small hotel in Torquay called Fawlty Towers. Basil was not simply rude. He was something more precise and more tragic than that. He was a man who had convinced himself that he deserved better than the life he had, that he was fundamentally superior to his circumstances, his guests, his wife, his staff, and almost everyone he ever encountered. His snobbery was not casual but pathological, a kind of armor he wore against the terrifying possibility that he might actually be ordinary. The genius of the character was that the audience could always see, with absolute clarity, exactly what Basil couldn't see about himself. His schemes never worked. His manipulations always backfired. His desperate attempts to impress the kind of refined upper-class guests he considered his social equals invariably ended in humiliation, and not because of bad luck, but because of who Basil fundamentally was. The comedy was merciless, but it was also, underneath everything, deeply compassionate. You laughed at Basil, but you also recognized him. You had met him. You might, on your worst days, have been him. When Fawlty Towers premiered on the BBC in September 1975, the critical response was, by most accounts, baffled. One review famously called it a disaster, which, given that the show was about a hotel that was essentially in a state of permanent disaster, might have been more accurate than the critic intended. The public, however, understood immediately. They saw themselves in Basil's overcomplicated lies, in Sybil's withering sighs, in Manuel's cheerful incomprehension, and in Polly's weary competence holding the whole impossible enterprise together. The ratings grew, word spread, and Fawlty Towers began its unlikely ascent toward immortality. A great script needs great performers, and Fawlty Towers was blessed with one of the finest ensembles in British television history. Each of the four principal characters was perfectly cast, and each brought something to the show that elevated it beyond what was on the page. Prunella Scales as Sybil Fawlty was a revelation. Sybil was not simply the nagging wife of crude comedy tradition. She was a fully realized human being who had, somewhere along the line, made the calculation that her best strategy for surviving married life with Basil was to meet his grandiosity with an absolute refusal to be impressed by anything he did. Her delivery was a masterwork of comic timing, each syllable of Basil, a small precision instrument designed to puncture whatever delusion her husband was currently inflating. Scales brought a real intelligence to the role, a sense that Sybil was not a victim of her circumstances, but a woman who had, in her own way, found a kind of power in them. Andrew Sachs as Manuel brought something rarer still, genuine pathos. Manuel, the Spanish waiter who understood almost nothing that was said to him, and was physically abused by Basil on a fairly regular basis, could easily have been a one-note caricature. In Sachs's hands, he was something much more moving, an essentially innocent figure navigating a world that made no sense to him, doing his absolute best, and being rewarded for his efforts with frying pans to the head. Behind the physical comedy was real craft. Sachs was a serious actor who understood that the funniest thing about Manuel was not his confusion, but his persistent goodwill in the face of it. The character worked because Sachs never played him for pity, only for truth. The physical demands Sachs endured on set were considerable and, at times, genuinely harmful. During production, a frying pan intended to land gently on his head in one scene was, in an early take, rather more substantial than intended, leaving him with a real bruise. A later scene involving fire resulted in actual minor burns. Sachs, by all accounts, absorbed these indignities with the same cheerful philosophical acceptance that Manuel brought to absorbing Basil's rages. His dedication was total. Connie Booth's Polly was the gravitational center of the show, the character whose sanity provided the fixed point around which everything else could revolve in complete insanity. Polly was resourceful, quick-thinking, and permanently, wearily resigned to the fact that her employers were incapable of getting through a single day without creating at least one situation that required her to manage, defuse, or cover up. Booth had, of course, co-written every word Polly spoke, which gave her a unique relationship with the character. She understood her not just as a performer, but as an architect.